The evening started like any other. Lights from the city filtered through the cafe windows, reflecting off damp streets, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. People chatted quietly, cups clinking, a low hum of background noise that usually went unnoticed. On the corner of the room, she sat, shoulders tense, hands folded around a lukewarm coffee cup. Every few seconds, her gaze darted toward the entrance, a flicker of hesitation betraying a mind already running through scenarios that might never happen. Across the cafe, he waited, calm, composed, yet his eyes held a flicker of awareness. He sensed the tension in the air, though he did not yet know its source. There was a rhythm to his movements, subtle adjustments of a coat, a small sip of water, a glance toward the door. Nothing dramatic, but the room seemed to pulse around him, as though sensing the significance of what was about to unfold. Outside, the evening deepened, rain-slicked streets reflecting neon signs and headlights. Every pedestrian hurried by, oblivious to the small, pivotal moment inside. Inside, every tick of the clock grew heavier. The distance between them was measured not in feet, but in anticipation. She shifted slightly, as if testing her courage, the leather of her bag creaking softly. The scent of rain mixed with coffee filled the air. Her chest tightened, her hands trembled faintly. She had agreed to this evening as a favor, a simple act of pretense. No expectations, no emotions. She thought she could manage that. Yet, even in the first few moments, the weight of unspoken truths pressed in. Every heartbeat seemed louder, each breath heavier. The sound of the door chimes startled her briefly. She looked up, eyes scanning, and then returned to her seat, forcing a composure she no longer entirely felt. He remained seated, adjusting his watch with precise movements, unaware that the trajectory of his evening was already shifting. The air between them thickened, intangible yet undeniably charged. Outside, the rain intensified, tapping against the glass, punctuating the silence. Each drop seemed to echo the tension in the room, marking the passage of seconds that felt like hours. In these early moments, neither of them spoke. Words would come later. Now, the world narrowed to the space between them, the shared glance of awareness that neither had yet acknowledged. The night had begun, but it was already clear that it would end differently than either expected. A waitress passed by, offering a polite smile. Neither noticed. The flicker of neon outside cast long shadows across the floor, highlighting the subtle shifts in posture, the briefest glances, the tiniest hesitations. Everything mundane suddenly carried weight. As the cafe settled into its quiet rhythm, the unspoken promise of the evening hovered over them both. One would think a single favor could remain simple. One would be wrong. Moments stretched, each second a quiet drumbeat echoing inside the small cafe. She glanced at her watch, fingers brushing the cold metal, and felt a sudden spike of doubt. What if this was a mistake? What if the act of pretending, however brief, revealed more than either of them intended? He shifted in his seat, the faintest furrow appearing between his brows. He did not speak. Words had not yet formed, and the gravity of anticipation filled the room more than any sentence ever could. The rain outside intensified, casting liquid reflections that danced across the floor, highlighting the distance between them, both physical and emotional. Every passing moment pulled them closer, yet the air between them remained charged with unspoken questions. Would a simple favor remain simple? Could they maintain the boundaries they had agreed upon? She felt the weight of her own expectations pressing down, mingling with the fear of letting them slip. A small laugh erupted from a nearby table, brief and mundane, yet in that instant, it seemed to slice through her composure. She caught her reflection in the darkened glass behind the counter, a hesitant, uncertain figure clutching a coffee cup as if it were an anchor. Across the room, he noticed the subtle tremble of her hands, the way her eyes flicked toward the door, the fleeting hesitation in her posture. He recognized the signs of someone carefully constructing a facade, someone trying to guard their vulnerability even as it threatened to spill over. Outside, headlights glinted on wet asphalt, tracing lines that seemed to lead directly to this moment. The rhythm of the city carried on, unaware of the convergence occurring within a small corner of it. She took a deep breath, finally setting the cup down, fingers lingering on the rim longer than necessary. The air seemed heavier now, the silence thicker, as if the cafe itself held its breath. Somewhere deep inside, she realized that the night would not end as planned. The favor would no longer be a mere transaction of kindness. It was already evolving into something far more intimate, far more consequential. And then, in a quiet movement almost too small to notice, their eyes met. Not in recognition, not yet in understanding, but in the faintest acknowledgement of what might come. A spark of something unspoken passed between them. A question, a possibility, a shift in the gravity of the evening. The tension held, unbroken, stretching into a moment that felt suspended in time. Outside, rain fell in steady rhythms, but inside, everything slowed, each heartbeat magnified. The favor she had agreed to undertake suddenly carried the weight of every unasked question, every hidden hope, every fear she had carefully tucked away. And in that charged silence, both of them understood something fundamental. This evening, meant to be simple and brief, was no longer under their control. It had taken a life of its own, and neither could predict the consequences. The night had begun, but the true story, the real reckoning of hearts, was only just starting. The evening outside darkened further, streets glistening under the glow of streetlights. Inside, the cafe had thinned out, the low hum of conversation replaced by the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. Every sound felt amplified, every movement more deliberate. She leaned forward slightly, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with a finger, her thoughts spiraling through scenarios she wasn't prepared to face. She had promised herself this would be a simple favor, a brief performance to help a friend. But the tension in the air reminded her that life rarely adhered to plans. Across the room, he adjusted his jacket, his posture steady, yet his eyes betrayed subtle curiosity and caution. He did not move toward her, did not speak, yet the connection in that small space, the unspoken recognition, was undeniable. Time seemed to stretch, each second heavy with anticipation. The cafe's lights cast long, shifting shadows, highlighting the empty spaces between tables, the subtle movements of other patrons, and the intimacy of the corner where they sat. Outside, rain whispered against windows, a soft percussion that underscored the mounting tension. Moments passed without exchange, yet their awareness of one another grew. She sensed the shift, the unspoken possibility that the night held more than an agreed-upon pretense. He, too, felt it, the faint tremor in the atmosphere that suggested a line had already been crossed without either realizing it. She exhaled slowly, attempting to steady the fluttering in her chest. Memories of previous encounters, half-forgotten conversations, and fleeting thoughts collided with the present, creating a cocktail of uncertainty and longing she hadn't anticipated. Outside, the city moved on. Cars, pedestrians, the distant wail of a siren. But inside, time contracted. Each heartbeat echoed louder. Each glance became a statement. Each breath a subtle admission. The favor she had agreed to was no longer just a favor. It had begun to take shape, forming contours of connection she could not yet name. He shifted slightly, fingers brushing against the edge of his table, a micro-movement that drew her attention. She noticed, acutely, the curve of his expression, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to hold both caution and invitation. It was a silent negotiation of space, intent, and emotion, carried out without a single word. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, the clatter of dishes and soft murmur of conversation fading into the background. leaving only the tension between them. Every second, every motion, every glance reinforced the fragile bridge being built, one they could cross together or crumble with a single misstep. As the first part of the evening drew on, the air grew heavier with expectation. She had come to fulfill a favor, but the night had begun to rewrite the rules. Both of them were aware, even if silently, that what started as a simple lie was already evolving into something far more complex, something neither could ignore. The cafe had emptied further. Only a few scattered patrons remained. Each tick of the clock became sharper, more pronounced, marking the stretch of seconds that carried a silent weight. She shifted in her seat, a subtle adjustment meant to hide the nervous tremor that betrayed her calm exterior. He continued to watch, almost imperceptibly, studying her movements, aware of the tension in the room, yet careful not to disturb it. His thoughts were measured, but beneath the control, curiosity and anticipation churned quietly, like a river beneath a frozen surface. Outside, the rain intensified, tapping a rhythm that echoed the quickening pulse of her chest. Each drop traced the window pane, drawing tiny rivulets that distorted the lights of the street beyond. Inside, the warmth of the cafe contrasted with the chill outside, creating a cocoon in which time slowed and expectations loomed larger than reality. She glanced at him, trying to measure whether he had noticed the subtle signs of her anxiety. The micro-expressions, the fraction of a second pauses, the tiny hesitations, they all spoke louder than words could. He, in turn, observed with a quiet precision, noting the way her shoulders tensed, the shift in her gaze, the faint tremor in her hands. The unspoken energy between them thickened, each movement charged with significance. Every sip of coffee, every brush of a hand against a cup, every glance toward the door, all became part of an invisible dialogue that neither fully understood, yet both recognized. The evening carried on, yet the world outside seemed distant, muted. The city moved past, unaware that a quiet, extraordinary tension had settled in this small corner. Each breath, each heartbeat, each faint rustle of paper or clink of ceramic became magnified, like notes in a symphony of anticipation. She exhaled, letting her fingers linger on the cup a moment longer, as if drawing courage from its warmth. The thought that this simple act, an agreed-upon favor, might unravel more than she intended pressed in from all sides. Could she navigate the delicate balance between pretense and reality? Could he? He adjusted his posture again, careful, deliberate. The subtle curve of his mouth hinted at recognition of the fragile dance they were both performing. Every glance was a negotiation, every movement a question, every pause an invitation. The room itself seemed to bend around the unspoken possibilities, the quiet charge in the air. In that charged silence, anticipation grew. A single misstep could break the tenuous balance, yet every moment pulled them closer, deeper into a connection neither had planned, but both had begun to feel. The favor was no longer just a favor. It had become a moment suspended between expectation and revelation, uncertainty and desire. As the second part of the evening unfolded, the tension peaked, carrying them toward an inevitable confrontation with their own feelings. The night had begun as a simple agreement, yet it was already shaping itself into something neither could ignore, something that would leave an indelible mark on both their lives. Dawn approached, but the cafe remained a quiet refuge from the city's awakening. The first light of morning traced soft lines across the floor, illuminating the small corner where they had spent the night, a space now charged with unspoken possibilities. She sat back in her chair, eyes scanning the menu she hadn't really read, her mind replaying the moments from the evening. Every movement, every glance, every word that had been spoken, or left unsaid, was etched into her memory. The simple favor she had agreed to had transformed into a complex tangle of emotion she was only beginning to recognize. Across from her, he sipped his coffee, seemingly calm, yet the tension in his shoulders and the careful way he held his cup betrayed his own inner awareness. He, too, felt the weight of what had passed and the uncertainty of what might come. The quiet intimacy of shared space was a fragile bridge between two strangers and something more, something undefined yet undeniable. Outside, the city began to stir. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout of a street vendor, and the low rumble of buses formed a backdrop that felt almost surreal against the focused intensity inside the cafe. Time seemed suspended, each second magnified, each gesture weighted with meaning. She traced her finger along the rim of her cup again, recalling the subtle micro-movements, the glances, the slight hesitations. She realized that the evening had revealed more than a favor. It had revealed vulnerability, trust, and a resonance she hadn't anticipated. Her heart, cautious and wary, recognized the danger and allure simultaneously. He observed her quietly, noting the shifts in posture, the faint catch in her breath, the way her eyes lingered on objects in the room as if to ground herself. He understood that beneath the composed exterior lay a storm of questions, fears, and tentative hope. And he knew, in that silent observation, that the next steps would matter more than any carefully constructed plan. The rain from the previous night had ceased, but the streets were still damp, reflecting the morning light in scattered, shimmering patterns. The world outside moved on, unaware of the delicate convergence happening inside this small corner of the city. She finally looked up, and their eyes met, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes without a single word. It was a recognition that what had begun as a simple agreement had become something intricate, layered, and emotionally charged. The favor had opened a door neither expected to encounter, a threshold leading into the uncharted territory of connection, possibility, and emotional risk. For the first time since the night began, she felt a sliver of clarity. The favor was no longer just an obligation, it was a catalyst. And both of them were acutely aware that what came next could not be undone, could not be easily controlled, and yet was impossibly compelling. Time stretched further, each passing moment carrying them closer to the inevitable crossroads, a choice between pretense and truth, between comfort and exposure, between the simplicity of a favor and the complexity of the heart. The morning grew brighter, sunlight spilling through the windows in uneven shards. The cafe, once a retreat, now felt like a stage upon which every subtle glance, every micro-expression carried weight. She noticed the way he straightened slightly when the server brought their orders, the controlled exhale, the barely perceptible tension in his fingers as they wrapped around the cup. Outside, the city roared to life, indifferent to the quiet storm inside. Cars rattled over wet streets, footsteps echoed against building walls, and distant voices carried hints of mundane urgency. But inside that corner, time seemed to stretch, every second laden with the possibility of revelation or misstep. She sipped her coffee slowly, tasting the bitter warmth, the slight burn, grounding herself in sensation to quiet the tempest of emotion that had built overnight. Her mind wandered to the events that led her here, the favor that had seemed simple and trivial but had quickly turned into a labyrinth of anticipation, curiosity, and unspoken feeling. He watched without overt movement, reading the subtle cues in her posture, the tilt of her head, the flicker of her eyes toward the door, as if wondering if anyone else might enter and disrupt the fragile equilibrium. Every minute, every micro-action, was a wordless conversation that neither dared to articulate. The cafe's background noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clatter of dishes, the soft murmur of remaining patrons, formed a gentle soundtrack to the silent tension. Each sound punctuated the invisible dialogue between them, emphasizing the space that was both intimate and perilous. She finally shifted, placing her hands flat on the table, fingertips brushing lightly against the wood. The contact grounded her, anchored her in the present while allowing her thoughts to spiral through what-ifs and possibilities. She realized that the evening's pretense had already faded. It had been replaced by something real, fragile, and charged with potential. Across from her, he mirrored the subtle gestures, his own hands resting lightly on the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough to create an unspoken connection. He understood the delicate balance. They could step closer or retreat, reveal or hide, acknowledge or deny. The power of choice was theirs, yet neither moved, letting the tension build. Minutes passed, each one thick with anticipation. She drew a deep breath, the steam from her cup curling around her face, mingling with the soft light. She was aware of how her heartbeat quickened, how her pulse throbbed in her temples, how every nerve was tuned to the presence of the other. The favor had created a space that was no longer defined by obligation, but by the emergent reality of connection. He caught the movement of her fingers as they traced absent patterns on the table, a subconscious rhythm that spoke louder than any words. He felt the same pull, the gravity of an interaction that had begun as simple and performative but had evolved into something neither could deny. Outside, the world continued its indifferent motion, unaware that within these walls, a single evening had transformed into the beginning of something neither could plan, predict, or control. The cafe, the coffee, the faint rustle of chairs and footsteps, all became part of the intimate landscape of a connection forming in real time, delicate, unpredictable, and entirely compelling. By the end of the morning, the invisible threads that bound them had grown taut with possibility. The favor had served its purpose but had left them with a more profound reality, a space where pretense and truth blurred, where hearts were quietly negotiating their next move, and where the story that would define them had already begun. The mid-afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cafe floor, highlighting the gentle movements of patrons who were oblivious to the quiet drama unfolding in the corner. She shifted slightly in her chair, the leather creaking softly under her weight, a subtle acknowledgement of the tension she carried within. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every breath deliberate, as if she were consciously measuring the distance between herself and the man across the table. He studied her with careful attention, noting the slight furrow of her brow, the way her fingers traced absent patterns on the table, the faint tremble in her lips as she fought to maintain composure. Each gesture, minor and almost imperceptible to others, conveyed volumes in the language they had developed over the past hours of unspoken connection. The world outside continued unabated. Cars honked, a distant siren wailed, pedestrians called to one another, and the scent of street food mingled with exhaust fumes. Yet inside, these external disturbances felt muted, softened into a distant background hum. The cafe had become a cocoon, a private stage for a story that was only theirs to tell. Her gaze flicked to the entrance repeatedly, an unconscious dance of anticipation and doubt. She remembered the favor, the reason for their encounter, and how quickly it had evolved into a space charged with vulnerability and quiet hope. The tension was not just hers, it mirrored his. Every small movement, every subtle cue, reflected a shared uncertainty, a mutual acknowledgement of possibilities yet unexplored. He reached for his cup, fingers brushing lightly against the ceramic, the faint warmth grounding him even as his thoughts raced. Each sip was measured, deliberate, as if he were pacing himself against the surge of feeling threatening to break through the calm exterior. The favor had created a temporary bridge, but now they faced the challenge of crossing it without collapsing under the weight of what had begun to emerge between them. A sudden burst of laughter from a nearby table broke the spell momentarily, forcing her to adjust in her seat. She exhaled slowly, trying to settle the rapid thrum of adrenaline that coursed through her. She realized how precarious the balance had become. One wrong word, One misstep, and the fragile connection could unravel. Yet, at the same time, the danger of miscommunication made every glance, every gesture, more precious. He caught the faintest hint of her smile, the subtle lift at the corner of her lips, and felt an unexpected warmth. It was fleeting but enough to affirm that the path forward, though uncertain, held potential for something genuine. They were no longer bound by the initial pretense of a favor. The moment had shifted, evolving into a space of real emotion, quiet tension, and the unspoken promise of understanding. The cafe's rhythm continued, indifferent yet perfectly timed. Each sound, the clatter of cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft murmur of conversations, served to emphasize the intimacy of their shared bubble. It was in these small, almost mundane details that the weight of possibility hung heaviest. By the end of the afternoon, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of awareness, curiosity, and cautious hope. Every glance, every breath, every subtle movement had contributed to a tapestry of connection that neither could ignore. The favor had set the stage, but now the story belonged entirely to them, fragile, compelling, and alive with promise. The city felt different that afternoon, as if aware that something was shifting in the lives of two people who had, until recently, been strangers. The streets were crowded, yet the world seemed to conspire to make their paths cross. A late train screeched, the chatter of pedestrians echoed, and the distant wail of sirens punctuated the mundane rhythm of urban life. She walked briskly, not out of hurry but from the restless energy building inside. Each step carried the weight of unspoken questions and the faint thrill of anticipation. Her thoughts returned repeatedly to the previous evening, to the delicate moments that had revealed more than either had intended to show. The favor had been a simple arrangement, but it had unlocked a labyrinth of possibilities she hadn't been prepared to navigate. Across the city, he moved with deliberate ease, yet his mind was far from calm. Every decision he made, every person he passed, seemed tinted with the memory of her presence. He replayed the subtle exchanges, the brief touches, the shared glances that had quietly redefined the boundaries between them. The city around him blurred into a backdrop, an urban tapestry against which the drama of connection was unfolding. Inside the cafe, the table they had claimed yesterday remained untouched by anyone else, as if preserved for the moment that would inevitably follow. The barista moved through routines, unaware of the delicate tension threading the air, the quiet anticipation that hummed in the space between customers and chairs. She paused outside, taking a deep breath. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint scent of rain lingering on the streets. Her heartbeat quickened, a rhythm that echoed in the subtle sway of her shoulders. The evening of the favor had ended, but its resonance persisted, a faint hum of tension and possibility that refused to be ignored. Moments later, he arrived, the faint tap of his shoes on the pavement alerting her subconsciously. Neither spoke immediately. Words seemed unnecessary, each aware that the smallest glance or shift in posture carried more meaning than any casual conversation could. The city continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the intimate gravity forming in a quiet corner of a cafe. Outside, a delivery bike rattled past, horns blared, pedestrians called greetings to one another. Yet inside, time slowed, encapsulating the delicate thread of interaction that had emerged. She entered, letting the door swing softly behind her. The air shifted imperceptibly, the mingling of scents, the subtle change in temperature, the near-silent acknowledgement that something significant was about to unfold. He lifted his gaze, and their eyes met, a quiet, loaded recognition that stretched the space between them into a tangible moment. The table between them became a stage where anticipation played out silently. Each movement, adjusting a cup, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, shifting in a chair, was a gesture weighted with meaning. Neither needed to speak, yet the shared awareness hummed with unspoken dialogue, a conversation conducted through glances, posture, and the faint, almost imperceptible rhythm of breathing. Outside, life moved on, unmindful of the delicate tension suspended inside. Yet for them, each second was a thread, weaving the fabric of a connection that could not be ignored, a story that had begun with a favor and now demanded presence, attention, and the courage to navigate the unknown. Evening settled over the city like a soft, velvet curtain, dimming the harsh edges of reality and casting long shadows across the streets. The cafe had emptied, leaving a few lingering patrons whose quiet chatter seemed almost ceremonial against the backdrop of their stillness. She lingered over her cup, hands wrapped around the warmth, feeling it seep into her palms, grounding her against the torrent of thought swirling inside. Outside, the neon lights began to flicker on, painting the wet pavement in shades of amber and rose. Reflections shimmered in puddles, the world fractured into fragments of color that moved with each passing car. She watched, momentarily mesmerized, the city reflecting her own disjointed emotions, a mixture of anticipation, fear, and an unacknowledged hope. He remained seated across from her, observing the subtle play of light across her features, noting the way shadows softened the tension in her eyes. Every movement she made, however small, was a narrative of its own. Adjusting her coat, tracing the rim of her cup, letting a strand of hair fall loosely across her cheek. It was in these delicate, almost inconsequential gestures that the depth of feeling revealed itself. The favor had ended hours ago, yet the weight of it lingered in every glance and unspoken thought. Neither wanted to break the fragile equilibrium that had begun to form. There was a quiet understanding, a mutual awareness that what had begun as a simple arrangement had unfolded into something far more delicate and complex. The barista passed by, stacking cups with the casual efficiency of someone unaware of the intimate storm contained in a corner of the cafe. The aroma of coffee was richer now in the fading light, mingling with the faint scent of rain from the street. It was comforting yet unsettling, a reminder that life outside continued with relentless pace even as this moment demanded stillness. She shifted in her seat, eyes flicking toward the door, almost as if testing the world beyond the cafe's walls. Her pulse quickened at every footstep, every soft click of heels or shuffle of a bag on the floor. He noticed, and a quiet smile tugged at the corners of his lips, not mocking, not teasing, but acknowledging the shared tension that hummed between them. Outside, a distant siren wove through the evening air, drawing her attention briefly, a reminder of the city's constant, indifferent pulse. Yet here, within the confines of this small, dimly lit cafe, time seemed elastic. Minutes stretched, elongated by shared glances and the silent communication that had grown between them. They were both aware that the night could alter the delicate balance. Any misstep, any misinterpreted signal, could fracture what had been so carefully constructed. Yet each passing second also reinforced the bond forming, an unspoken trust that had begun to root itself quietly in the space between them. She finally lifted her gaze fully, meeting his eyes with a subtle courage that had not been there before. For a moment, words felt unnecessary. The city outside might rage with chaos, but within this small pocket of shared awareness, nothing else existed. The favor, the pretense, the arrangement, all of it faded, leaving only the weight of real, human connection. And in that shared, silent acknowledgement, a new chapter began, fragile and tentative, yet filled with the promise that what had been started as a simple act of kindness was now evolving into something neither could have anticipated. Night deepened, wrapping the city in shadows and the soft hum of distant traffic. The cafe's warm glow contrasted sharply with the darkness outside, forming a protective barrier around them. She traced the rim of her cup absent-mindedly, letting her thoughts wander through the unexpected turn the evening had taken. Each memory, each sensation, intertwined with the awareness of his presence, creating a quiet storm that neither had yet given words to. He observed the subtle movements, the slight tilt of her head, the faint lift of her eyebrows, the way her fingers tapped gently against the table. These small, almost invisible gestures conveyed more than conversation ever could. He understood the language of silence now, a code written in the spaces between glances, in the pauses and hesitations that marked their shared understanding. Outside, the rain had begun anew, soft at first, then heavier, tapping rhythmically against the window. The sound was a steady companion, accentuating the intensity of their mutual focus. She leaned back slightly, letting the cool air from the door sweep across her face, grounding herself against the emotions that threatened to overflow. He noticed the subtle change, the slight exhale of relief, the way her eyes flicked upward for just a moment before returning to him. Every shift in posture, every quiet breath, was a signal he read without thought. The favor, the pretense, had melted away completely, leaving raw honesty in its place. The city outside moved on, oblivious to the fragile world contained in that corner. Footsteps echoed, neon lights flickered, a siren wailed somewhere in the distance. But inside, time slowed, allowing them to navigate the uncharted terrain of emotion, anticipation, and cautious hope. She finally moved her hand, resting it atop the table, fingers curling slightly toward him. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but it spoke of trust, tentative connection, and a willingness to step further into the unknown. He responded subtly, leaning in just enough to meet her gesture, acknowledging without breaking the fragile tension. Moments stretched, elongated by the shared awareness of possibility. Each second was weighted with unspoken questions, fears, and the thrill of something unanticipated taking root. They were no longer simply participants in a favor. They were explorers in a territory defined by mutual vulnerability and curiosity. The barista's footsteps passed by once more, the clink of cups and hum of the espresso machine serving as a reminder of normalcy. Yet nothing could diminish the intensity of the bubble they had created. Every glance exchanged, every quiet acknowledgement, became a thread in the tapestry of a story neither had planned to write, but both were now deeply invested in. By the end of the night, the cafe stood nearly empty, leaving only the two of them amidst the soft glow and the rhythmic tapping of rain. The weight of unspoken truths, the remnants of the favor, and the unexpected depth of connection hung in the air. They had crossed a threshold together, fragile and delicate, yet undeniably significant. And in that stillness, the first real promise of something lasting had begun to form, subtle yet insistent, a quiet force ready to carry them into the next chapter of their unexpected journey. Morning arrived slowly, pale sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting thin stripes across the wooden floor. The world outside had resumed its relentless pace, cars honking, footsteps echoing, distant voices carried by the wind. Inside, the apartment was quiet, almost serene, yet the weight of the previous night lingered like a presence neither could ignore. She moved carefully through the space, each step deliberate, sensing that everything had changed in ways she couldn't yet articulate. The coffee machine hissed in the corner, filling the air with warmth and familiarity, yet it could not dispel the tight knot of anticipation coiled in her chest. Every glance at the doorway, every sound from the street, drew her mind back to him, to the subtle yet undeniable connection that had grown between them. He was already awake, sitting by the window, absorbed in thought. Sunlight caught the contours of his face, highlighting the concentration in his eyes, the faint crease in his brow, the subtle tension in his jaw. He hadn't yet looked at her, yet she could feel the intensity of his presence, the gravity that had quietly settled over them both since last night. Outside, the city moved with indifferent urgency, but within these walls, time had a different rhythm. Every second stretched, filled with unspoken words, shared memories of a night that had begun as a simple favor and now carried the weight of something far deeper. She found herself pacing, back and forth, hands brushing along the edge of the counter, tracing the familiar patterns of the apartment as if grounding herself. Each gesture mirrored the turmoil of her thoughts, excitement mixed with apprehension, hope entwined with fear. The balance they had achieved last night was fragile, and she feared a single misstep could shatter it completely. He finally looked up, eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. There was no city, no traffic, no distant sirens, only the space between them, charged with anticipation and the promise of untold possibilities. It was a silent exchange, a wordless acknowledgement of the evolving connection that neither had anticipated. The morning light shifted, catching on the rim of her mug as she took a sip, the warmth spreading through her in contrast to the chill of uncertainty that lingered beneath the surface. The favor, the pretense, all of it seemed trivial now against the gravity of what had begun to emerge. And in that quiet, suspended moment, both understood that the next steps mattered. Every glance, every gesture, every pause would shape the story unfolding between them, a delicate narrative of trust, vulnerability, and discovery. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, knowing that the choices made in these early hours could define the path ahead. The connection was fragile, yet resilient, ready to grow into something neither had fully expected, but both silently desired. Afternoon settled with a hesitant light, filtering through the cafe's windows in long, golden streaks. The noise of the city felt distant, muted, as if the universe had created a pocket of quiet just for them. They sat opposite each other, separated by the small table, yet every movement, every blink, every subtle shift carried meaning. She stirred her tea slowly, watching the swirl of cream and thinking about the night they had shared. The simple favor that had brought them together had dissolved into moments of raw honesty and quiet revelation. Her thoughts flitted between hope and fear, each one pulling her in a different direction. Could something real come from pretense? Could a single night redefine the boundaries of what she believed possible? He watched her over the rim of his own cup, noticing the way her fingers lingered on the handle, the delicate lift of her chin as she considered her words, the fleeting shadow of doubt crossing her features. He felt a deep desire to bridge the distance, to reassure, to anchor this fragile connection they had created. But he understood that rushing would ruin everything, that the patience of quiet observation now mattered more than any declaration. Outside, the city moved in a blur of motion, but inside, their shared silence carried a gravity that demanded attention. Each second seemed stretched, layered with unspoken possibilities, the tension of potential choices hovering like a suspended note in a melody neither could yet resolve. A waiter passed by, the soft clink of a cup against a saucer momentarily breaking the spell, but it did not diminish the intensity of their awareness of each other. Every glance, every subtle motion, became a thread weaving the tapestry of their evolving relationship. The favor, the pretense, the simple beginnings, they were all gone now, replaced by the raw, unfiltered space between two people discovering one another. She finally spoke, her words measured, tentative, but carrying a weight that only the quiet intimacy of their connection could support. Her voice was low, almost absorbed by the ambient sound of the cafe, but it resonated with an honesty that reached him directly. He responded with a gentle nod, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips, acknowledging her words without interrupting the fragile rhythm that had been established. This was not the time for grand gestures or sweeping confessions. It was a moment of understanding, a mutual recognition of the depth of feeling that had quietly taken root. The afternoon waned, sunlight slipping away from the windows and leaving the cafe bathed in a soft, warm glow. They remained there, suspended in a quiet world of their own making, navigating the tender complexities of emerging trust and growing attachment. And in that shared stillness, both knew that the coming days would test the boundaries of what they had discovered, that choices would have to be made, risks taken, and hearts opened. Yet, beneath the uncertainty, there was an undeniable certainty, an unspoken promise that whatever came next, they were no longer walking separate paths. As the day drew to a close, the cafe emptied, leaving them in a cocoon of quiet intimacy. Every heartbeat, every glance, every subtle sigh became part of a narrative neither had anticipated, but both were now irrevocably a part of. The restaurant was quiet, almost empty, yet the space between them vibrated with anticipation. Every subtle glance, every slight movement carried the weight of everything that had led them here. Neither spoke, but the air was thick with unspoken questions and the fragile promise of resolution. He reached across the table, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. The gesture was simple, yet it carried volumes: apology, acknowledgement, and a quiet plea for trust. She met his eyes, searching for truth, for clarity, for the assurance that the connection they had built was genuine. Outside, the city pulsed on, oblivious to the delicate drama unfolding within these walls. The faint hum of passing traffic, the distant laughter of pedestrians, even the occasional clatter from the kitchen faded into insignificance against the gravity of the moment. A waiter passed by, offering a polite smile, but they barely registered it. Time seemed to stretch, compress, and fold in on itself. Every heartbeat, every breath, every blink of an eye mattered. She finally exhaled, a small, almost imperceptible sound that carried the weight of months of doubt and anticipation. It was an acknowledgement of their journey, the acceptance of vulnerability, and the recognition that what had started as a favor had transformed into something far more profound. He leaned back slightly, allowing a brief smile to touch his lips, subtle but sincere. It was not a triumphant grin or a theatrical gesture. It was a quiet reflection of relief, understanding, and hope. Words were unnecessary now. The shared silence spoke louder than any sentence could. It conveyed trust, the fragile balance between past mistakes and future possibilities, and the comfort of finally being seen and understood. The light shifted through the window, casting a soft glow across the table. Shadows played gently across their faces, highlighting features softened by emotion, eyes brightened by understanding, and hearts lightened by the intimacy of shared experience. Every detail mattered: the tilt of her head, the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the small movements that had gone unnoticed until now. These were the fragments of connection, fragile yet enduring, that defined the culmination of everything they had navigated together. And in that quiet, suspended space, they both understood. The favor had been the beginning, the pretense had dissolved, and the honest connection that remained was something neither could have planned, but both would cherish. She laughed softly, a sound that carried both relief and disbelief, like someone finally letting go of a burden they had carried for too long. He smiled in return, not a smile of triumph, but of understanding, an acknowledgement that they had both survived the uncertainties, the doubts, and the pretense. Outside, the city continued to move, indifferent to their small, intimate world, yet it no longer mattered. In this moment, all that existed was the quiet certainty that they had found something genuine in each other. They walked together afterward, side by side, the small spaces between them filled with warmth and unspoken promises. Hands brushed, then lingered, tentative at first, before settling comfortably. Words came when necessary, but often they were unnecessary. The understanding between them was complete without them. The night sky stretched above, city lights glittering like distant stars. He looked at her, eyes reflecting a depth of feeling that had grown steadily from the first glance, the first favor, the first hesitant connection. She returned the gaze, her expression soft, yet luminous with the knowledge that what they had found was rare, fragile, and entirely worth holding. They paused at a quiet corner, the ambient noise of the city fading into background hum. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rain on asphalt and something sweeter, more personal, more immediate, the shared heartbeat of two people who had found each other against all odds. And in that stillness, in that perfect, suspended instant, they knew that the story had shifted. What began as a simple, innocent favor had blossomed into an honest, heartfelt connection. There were no pretense, no games, no barriers, only the quiet, unshakable truth of their emotions. She rested her hand lightly against his, and he squeezed it, a silent confirmation that they were together, fully present, and ready to face the future as a pair. The night continued, unhurried, full of possibilities, yet no longer uncertain. Their laughter mingled with the soft city sounds, the echo of tentative hope turned into reality. They walked forward, not as strangers, not as participants in a small pretense, but as two people who had discovered the unexpected, undeniable depth of genuine connection. And as they disappeared into the evening, side by side, the world seemed larger, warmer, and infinitely more promising. Proof that even the smallest acts, even the simplest favors, can become the most significant beginnings of all.